We're beginning to realize that cities are not places that are biologically uninteresting. They're actually places where the ecology is changing so quickly that a lot of animals and plants that live in cities are adapting, are evolving very rapidly. So my name is Menno Schilthuizen. I'm a biologist, an evolutionary biologist from the Netherlands, and I work here at the National Natural History Museum in Leiden. So I study how species of animals and plants change over time because of evolution.
You see that here there's a lot of junk food, a lot of fast food, a lot of easy food for birds to make use of. And even though it's not very busy now, you see that the birds are everywhere. They're really observing the people. They're sitting on the roofs. There's jackdaws and gulls, more herring gulls there. There are pigeons on the floor, and they're constantly on the lookout for people who drop some French fries. Their whole behavior is adapted to making use of people. It's a very different ecology from what their natural way of finding food would be. So they really become more tolerant of people, they become more inventive, they become more curious. And those are not things they learn. I mean, there's also things they learn, but these are also traits of a personality that have a genetic basis. So there's DNA for curiousness, and there's DNA for problem solving. And we see that in urban birds and mammals, those personalities are slowly evolving. You can actually measure that.
Siden Charles Darwin fremlagde sin teori om evolution, har vi altid betragtet udviklingen af liv som noget, der finder sted over tusindvis af år. Men i byen er det tydeligt, at evolution kan gå meget stærkere, end vi troede, fordi vi påvirker økosystemet så radikalt.
An ecosystem engineer is an organism which modifies its environment in such a way that new ways of life appear for other species. And the traditional examples are, for example, ants. Ants, they build their nests, and usually you see that there are lots of smaller animals, insects and millipedes, which have evolved the ability to live with the ants and to make use of the ants' way of modifying the environment. And in a way, humans are also ecosystem engineers. We also modify the environment. We call that, environmental destruction, but it's also an environmental modification. Because for a lot of animals and plants, human environments are still places where they can live, where they can find food and opportunities in ways that they couldn't before. So in a way, humans are also actually today's most important ecosystem engineer.
Well, we are here in the herbarium collection of our museum. This is where we keep all the dried plant specimens. And the one I'm holding here is a couple of specimens of Crepus sancta, which is one of the hawksbeard plants. And this is one of the first plants that was studied in terms of urban evolution. So researchers in Montpellier in the south of France discovered that the seeds of these plants in cities look different from the seeds outside of cities. So in these flower heads, after flowering, they produce two types of seeds. They produce large heavy seeds, and they produce smaller light seeds which have a little parachute. So the heavy seeds, they fall straight down, and the light seeds, they float away in the wind. And in natural environments, those are two good strategies, because the heavy seeds, they fall where the plant grows, the parent plant grows, so that's a good spot. The light seeds, they fly away, maybe germinating in a spot that is also suitable. But in the city, only two of those seeds is useful, namely the heavy seeds, because in the city usually there are only very small patches of soil for these plants to grow, and these light seeds, they will fly away and land on the street and not be able to germinate. So what these researchers were seeing was that in the city, these plants started producing more of the heavy seeds and fewer of the light seeds, and this is really a genetic difference which has evolved over just a few years.
We often think that evolution is a very slow process, that it takes millions of years, and sometimes it does. But if the environment changes very rapidly, very drastically, then evolution can actually proceed very fast, because you have very strong natural selection, you have very few individuals that have just the right characteristics, heritable characteristics, the right DNA. Our trade brings in a lot of species that are not native to an area, so you see that the ecosystem in a city is really a mix of native species and introduced species which meet each other in cities for the first time. Pollution is there, traffic, noise. It's a whole range of environmental factors that are different in cities compared to natural environments. We humans produce a lot of heat, and our machines produce a lot of heat, and it remains trapped between the tall buildings which block the wind, so you can get much higher temperatures in city centers than at the same time outside of city centers. Other things are the fact that vegetation is very fragmented in cities. If you go to a natural environment, everything is vegetated. It's a forest or a field or a swamp, but in any case, everywhere you find vegetation. But in the city, the vegetation is really limited to very small pockets, sometimes larger parks, but on any scale you find fragments of green, and that means that species that live in one green fragment often don't have any connection with species that live in another green fragment. So it's really an archipelago of islands of green.
This sample is from 1943, actually very nearby. These are maybe a bit boring because they're all the same. This bag has some more color differences. So these are all bags with empty shells of the garden snail. And it's all the same species, but they all look different. So their DNA determines the shell color. And because they've been studied for more than a century, we know exactly which genes are responsible for which shell colors. So if you have a bright yellow shell, pale yellow shell, like this one, for example, if that one in the summer is sitting in the full sun, the internal temperature of the snail inside is a little bit lower than if you would have a very dark snail like this one. It can be like 2 degrees Celsius difference. And in the middle of the summer, that could make the difference between dying and surviving. So we also know that when the climate changes, that also the evolution of these snails changes. And we see that in cities you have also this urban heat island, so it's extra hot. So you have an additional, even more rapid evolution towards these very pale yellow snails.
You see that urban evolution depends on different aspects of the urban environment, and one aspect are like more the physical and chemical differences of the city compared to natural environments. Think of heat, pollution. The factor itself doesn't change when an animal or plant adapts to it. For example, artificial light. The light that we see in the city at night does not change because animals are adapting to it. Insects that are active at night, like moths, for example, they suffer from the fact that there's all this artificial light, because traditionally, of course, 200 years ago, there was not this artificial light at night. The only light there were the stars and the moon. And they would use the moon, for example, to navigate. And now they are confused because you have all these artificial light sources, and a lot of moths are attracted to the light, and they stay the whole night close to the light, and they are wasting time, or they even get killed by the heat of the light sources. So we see that moths are adapting to this constant factor of light by becoming less sensitive to artificial light. But you also have a biological environment, of course. You have in the city, you have all kinds of predators and competitors and prey. So, for example, you have a peregrine falcon that is feeding on city pigeons, those are two species. So the city pigeon is a factor that influences the evolution of the peregrine falcon, and the peregrine falcon is a species that influences the evolution of the pigeon, because they are depending on each other for survival. And when you have this situation where you have two urban factors that are both evolving, then probably evolution can go extra fast, because you cannot become perfectly adapted to the other factor if the other factor is also constantly changing. We call this Red Queen evolution. And Red Queen is a character from Through the Looking Glass, of the sequel of Alice in Wonderland. The Red Queen, she tells Alice that in this place, in this dream world of the book, you have to keep running just to stay in the same place. And in a way, evolution is like that too. If you're a prey and you don't change, and the predator is changing and is becoming better and better at attacking the prey, then the prey will go extinct. So as a prey, you also have to keep evolving to stay in the same place.
So of course the city pigeon is really the sort of the eponymal urban animal. They live in southern Europe in very rocky environments, and in cities they find something very similar, so they're very suitable for living in these built-up centers of the city. But there's another reason why they're interesting from an urban evolution viewpoint, and that's that they have ways to adapt to heavy metal pollution. A lot of the structures in the city, metal structures, lamp poles and electricity pylons, they're covered in zinc to prevent corrosion of the steel, of the iron, and that flakes off. So there's in the groundwater, in the puddles of water in the city, there's quite a lot of zinc, which is toxic. The pigeons feed, they drink that water, so they get quite a lot of zinc in them. And it turns out that they can sort of make that zinc harmless by putting it in their feathers. So the melanin, the dark pigment in the feathers, binds to these metal ions, and the darker the pigeon is, the more melanin it has, so the more of these metal ions it can put in its feathers. So we see that in cities where you have a lot of pollution of zinc and other metals, you find a high proportion of city pigeons that are quite dark, because they are the ones that have a benefit from having that melanin in their feathers. So you see you have these pale gray forms, which is sort of the natural form, but you also have a darker gray, a really dark, almost anthracite color.
I think it's very fascinating that we see all these animals and plants really evolving very rapidly and building a new ecosystem. On the other hand, it's also an ecosystem that's relatively simple. The biodiversity in cities is higher than we think, but it's still not as high as in natural environments. And a lot of specialized species which have a very, very specific niche, they will not be able to survive in cities. So I think on the one hand we should appreciate what happens in cities more. We should, because most people are living in cities, so to enjoy nature, it's better to appreciate urban nature as well. But on the other hand, I think for protection of biodiversity, we also need protection of more or less pristine natural environments.